Welcome back. Let's start talking about the inequities in education. Historically, the education of white children has been treated much differently than the education of non-white students. Black children, throughout the period of enslavement, were usually forbidden any sort of formal education. And in many places in the South, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person how to read. There were schools for black children in a few pockets where free black communities had been allowed to grow, but for the most part, black children only learned what their families could teach them. After slavery was made illegal and the Civil War concluded, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau to assist the newly freed black Americans as they transitioned into society. One of the largest efforts was to establish schools for Southern black Americans that taught basic literacy and history. These were very popular, and adults and children alike attended them. The Freedmen's Bureau was abandoned by the federal government in 1872, however, and states and local jurisdictions refused to provide adequate funding to the schools throughout the rest of the 19th and well into the 20th century. Many of the major issues fought for by the civil rights movement was school integration and full funding of all schools. While school segregation by race is now illegal, we still have school segregation by socioeconomic class, which is strongly correlated with race. As we spoke about in an earlier lecture, Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their homes up through the 1970s and placed in boarding schools with terrible conditions and poor educational outcomes. Those with a boarding school education were considered so uneducated that white colleges would not admit the graduates. Latinx students were also segregated from white students, and much like black students, attended schools that were poorly funded and resourced. Much like Indigenous students, they were also required to assimilate to white cultural norms, including speaking only English in school. Beverly Tatum, who is one of the foremost scholars on race and education, discusses the disadvantage of integration. While segregated, black schools were definitely under-resourced, and that was a big problem. However, black students also had teachers and administrators who understood black culture and norms, and students were able to look up to people who looked like themselves. They also weren't subject to casual racism and microaggressions in their school environments. After integration, most teaching and administration positions went to white teachers, and hiring black and brown teachers has not been a priority. As part of social identity development is being able to imagine who we might become. As children, we learn that from the adults around us. If you can't see someone like yourself in a role, it's more difficult to imagine yourself in that role. One of the casualties of integration was generations of non-white children not seeing themselves as teachers or as authority figures outside of their homes. While we've come to understand how important it is for all children, not just children of color, to see non-white teachers and authority figures, we have significantly fewer non-white educators now to move into administrative positions, and fewer people of color going into the field of education. We've talked in the past about America's racial wealth gap, how the ability for white Americans to create generational wealth has created significant average wealth for modern white families, while Black and Latinx families have not had that advantage. The wealth gap is only part of the depth of racism in the United States, though. When we're talking about when we're talking about this as economic debt in part, schools are funded in large part by property taxes, which means predominantly white suburban schools, which are generally in more expensive areas, are able to spend on average twice as much per student as predominantly non-white urban schools. This is exacerbated by the fact that poor students need more resources to support them. Wealthier students are not generally worried about their basic needs, having shelter, food, and clothing. Wealthier students' families are also more likely to be able to provide supplemental equipment like computers and internet access, and supplemental assistance like tutors and after-school programs. Poorer students often do not have access to at least some of these resources, and what is lacking often needs to be made up for by the schools. The Rochester City School District is an example here. Such a high percentage of children live in low-income households in Rochester that breakfasts and lunches are provided by the schools to all students for free. When schools were forced to go online because of the pandemic, RCSD had to figure out not only how to teach online, but how to get all their students computers and wireless hotspots, but also how to continue to feed the students who wouldn't eat without the free breakfasts and lunches. Beyond the economic debt, there's a socio-political debt that families of color have been burdened with. We know that voter suppression most often affects areas with predominantly Black and Latinx voters. This affects their ability to have a voice, both through votes and through representation, on many issues affecting school districts. Systemic racism often means their opinions are not heard as well as they should be. Again, RCSD is an example. The district has been owed financial resources from the state for decades, and has even won court battles upholding this. The money never seems to make it into the state budget, however. Yet, when RCSD begins to have fiscal issues, the state is happy to audit the district, and there are calls for state takeovers from everywhere but the parents of the RCSD students. Finally, there's a moral debt. We have a strong national value that every child deserves a chance to succeed to his or her abilities and willingness to work. That's the reason we have free public education in the first place. Yet, we've set up a system that consistently places barriers in the way for children's ability to learn, starting with how we fund schools. It is a system designed to reduce social mobility rather than creating the meritocracy that we say we believe in. When you look at discussions of inequities in education, the phrase that almost always comes up is achievement gap, the difference in outcomes on measurable things like test scores and graduation rates. Inevitably, we see over and over again that there's a significant gap between white and Asian students and other non-white students. It's important to think about how we discuss this and how we describe this gap. We know this performance gap is due to the structural issues that hold back poor schools and predominantly non-white schools. Yet talking about it as an achievement gap makes it easy to blame the students and hypothesize that the problem is with them. Are they unmotivated? Do they not value education? Are they just less intelligent? Whenever we talk about the differences in performance in schools, it must always be in the context of the systemic inequities built into our education system, so that the students themselves are not punished for their circumstances. So, what can we do about this? How do we start to make changes? Tatum offers some ideas. First, we need to train, mentor, and hire more teachers of color. This is no small thing. It means creating incentives to encourage Black and brown people to go into the field of education, like subsidized tuition, developing mentorship programs with established teachers, and likely creating incentives for them to take on the extra work, and educating administrators as to why it's important to hire teachers of color, regardless of the makeup of their school district. Second, teachers need to know the families and communities of their students so they understand the values of those families and communities. Teachers imposing their own values on children that are contrary to what they're taught elsewhere creates hurt and distrust. Curriculums need to update to include a wider range of voices in history. This is important for all children. It's important for non-white children to hear about their own histories and see people like themselves to emulate. But also, we live in a global society. The majority of the world is not white and has an entirely different worldview than Americans. Teaching children about different viewpoints makes them less rigid and better able to work in the wider world. Finally, teachers with dominant identities, particularly white teachers and teachers with middle-class backgrounds, need to understand their own identities and how those relate to their students. Most of Tatum's suggestions will not be quick to implement. So what do we do in the meantime? Perez et al. From our text offer a possible option. In their study of academic resilience in undocumented Latinx youth, they identified a number of factors that relate to student success. They divided these into 4 areas: risk factors, personal protective factors, environmental protective factors, and academic factors. They found, not surprisingly, that the most protected students, those with fewer risk factors and more protective factors, were the most likely to be successful, and high-risk students with high risk factors and fewer protective factors were the least likely to be successful. What was surprising, though, was the group they called resilient students. These were students with more risk factors, but also more personal and environmental protective factors. They didn't perform academically as well as lower risk students, but they did significantly better than high risk students without the protective factors. Perez et al. Hypothesized that the protective factors help mitigate the psychosocial risks of the high risk factors in the students' lives, which enabled them to weather academic stress. Volunteer and extracurricular activities helped build networks with supportive adults and peers involved with other pro-social activities. This support network, along with aiding in family stability and emphasizing the importance of educational support to families, appears to be critical in the overall success of higher risk students. This can be extrapolated to other high risk populations and suggests that creating opportunities for extracurricular and volunteer activities is one of the better ways to ensure the success of these students.